Hello and welcome to another Conversations with Carrie. Today we're going to continue in our series on loss, grief, and mourning, and we're going to focus on the types of grief. It really should ideally be the types of mourning, but hey, it's called the types of grief, okay? The types of grief. And just to recapitulate, a loss is anything of value that we had in our experience and then is removed from our experience. And the grief is the emotion that is felt whenever there is a loss. And mourning is the expression of that grief. Okay, now it is known that when, and let's use worst case scenario, someone dies, okay, that's a loss, and the loss is felt by different people from different segments of society. And so based on the way people experience grief, they have put it into categories, okay? And so it's these categories which are considered types of grief. So as we go through, you can try to identify where you would fall in that category, and hopefully this will begin to start some dialogue on grief, the categories of grief, and how each person in their category deals with grief, okay? All right, let's get to it. You have what is called anticipatory grief. And anticipatory grief is when a loss is inevitable. All right, so the loss hasn't happened yet, but based on what is happening, the loss will happen. So persons have anticipatory grieving by beginning to imagine what life is going to be without that person or that thing, or that without that experience. All right, and they start experiencing the emotions of it, and in some cases they begin to plan how to get along without it. And in some instances this is actually a very good thing. All right, and we're gonna, well, when you come to our paid session, then you will get to understand exactly why this particular concept of anticipatory grieving is actually can be a good thing. The next is normal grieving, and normal grieving is there's a loss, there's a feeling of grief, and persons go through the stages of grief without complications, and then of course successfully overcome that loss. So we call it grieving successfully. All right, so that's what's considered normal. And then you have secondary grief. Now, secondary grief is when you have a loss as a result of a loss. So, for example, a person may lose their jobs, and because they lost their job, they're not able to pay their mortgage, so they end up losing their house. That's called a secondary loss. And then you have a cumulative or compound grieving. As this suggests, it's when you're grieving a loss and then another loss happens, so now you have two grieving experiences. All right, so one grief is already there, and while you're actively grieving this loss, another loss takes place. So it's called compound or cumulative grieving. Then you have delayed grieving, and delayed grieving is a loss happens. However, and this may be as a result of a position or a result of a personality, where this delayed grieving, or also it could be as a result of the type of loss. Okay, if it is a traumatic loss, sometimes person will, delay grieving because they probably get stuck in that denial phase. Okay, however, delayed grieving is the loss happens and there are other things going on that you have to focus on, so the person does not get that chance to grieve. Okay, the person doesn't get that chance to express their grief, they don't get a chance to mourn, and so it may be days later weeks later, months later, and sometimes even years later before this person actually faces up to the loss or has the chance to really look at the loss and grieve the loss. The thing to note here is that when the person does begin to grieve, the loss will feel like it's recent, like it's current, like it's now. Okay, and so they will go through that series of grief. Then you have chronic or prolonged grieving, and this is when the grief or the period of mourning extend beyond 1 month. Okay, so that's called prolonged grief. And typically what happens is that the feeling, okay, of grief gets more intense the longer the person grieves. And this is usually when a person is preoccupied with the thoughts of the loss. Okay, and also this could be as a result of bouncing through the stages of grief, not getting to the point of acceptance. Okay, so they may be delayed in the denial stage or the anger, right, or even the depression phase. All right, but they never get to the point of acceptance. So there is chronic grief greater than 1 month. Then you have collective grief. Collective grief is what is experienced by a community or a country or a region or the world. And we have a lot of examples of collective grief, okay, such as natural disasters will cause collective loss. Wars will cause collective loss, and then of course the big great COVID that was experienced globally and left so much loss in its wake. Okay, so that's called a collective grief, where it doesn't affect just one person or one family, but it affects multiple families, all right, or the entire country, an entire region, or the world. Then you have absent grief. Now, absent grief is just that it appears as if grief is absent. And absent grief is usually seen in in traumatic cases, okay, where the loss is so great or the experience is so traumatic that persons will build up a wall and just move along life as if that loss did not take place. Okay, so the person may appear as if they're not grieving. Okay, and this is all that it is. It's appearing that they're not grieving. But over time, their choices will indicate that, hey, they are grieving. Hey, they are protecting a wounded part of them. Okay, so it may appear as absent grief. Okay, then we have the complicated grief. And the complicated grief is when the person does not move through the stages of grief seamlessly. So we're supposed to move through stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then get over it, right? And I don't say get over it lightly, because I do understand that losses, they never really go away. But the way you look at loss and the way you approach loss can allow you to grieve successfully. All right, so grieving successfully means that you go through all the stages and then you get to the point where that emotion, that feeling of grief is no longer there. Okay, so that means you're not negatively affected by person, places, things, events, time of year, etc. Okay, because you've successfully grieved. However, with complicated grief, the person never gets to acceptance, and so they'll be moving from stage 1, 2, 3 of grief, going back to stage 1, getting all the way sometimes to stage 5 and going back to stage 1. Okay, so that's considered complicated grief. All right, so the idea is that they never get to the point of acceptance. Then you have the disenfranchised grief. Now, the disenfranchised grief is when a loss cannot be openly acknowledged and cannot be publicly mourned, or a loss that is not socially accepted or socially supported. All right. And so some examples of this are relationships that have no legitimacy. And there are so many, very many examples of that, like illicit affairs, or if there's a divorce. Sometimes this happens when there's a divorce and then a spouse is lost, or one of the divorced spouses is lost, and it's believed that the other should not be mourning, at least not openly, because they should have, the public perception is that they should have moved on from that relationship. So the experience of loss and the feeling of grief is not supported socially. Sometimes the loss itself is not recognized. And for example, if a lawbreaker, all right, dies, then typically it is not necessarily seen as a loss. All right. Sometimes the griever is not recognized. And this happens a lot, ladies and gentlemen, this happens a lot in nursing. A nurse has been taking care of a patient for extended periods of time. What sometimes we fail to recognize is that a relationship develops between the patient and the caregiver. When the person dies, the caregiver does feel a sense of loss, and they will grieve also. However, their grief is not, the griever, the nurse, is not recognized as someone who would be experiencing this loss and having the legitimacy to grieve. Okay. And sometimes the loss may involve a social stigma. All right. So if it is something that is stigmatized and there's a loss, then the grief is not acknowledged. Okay. So usually for persons experiencing the disenfranchised grief, they typically have complicated grieving as well. Okay. Because they're not given the opportunity, or they did not take the opportunity to allow themselves to grieve. All right. So disenfranchised grieving, quite interesting. So there you have it, the different types of grief. And now that you know, I hopefully that this information will help you to recognize what category you fall in,